Okay, here we are again for another Tech Talk. Today we're going to talk WebSockets. I see there's a few people checking in. Today we've got Principal Architect at Layer 7 of Ronnie Mitra, and he's joining us today from Toronto. You can see it's a little gray in Toronto. It's not so, I don't see any blue sky. But yeah, so today we're going to talk WebSockets, and I'm excited to have Ronnie with us. It's his first Tech Talk. So get your questions ready. There's a couple ways you can ask questions. We have our hashtag, which is just #Layer7Live. So, if you get busy at your desk or whatever, you got other things to do, you can always just hash in your Twitter question, and Ronnie will get to it. And you can chat through the stream. You can also email questions if you don't have time to sit around for the whole thing and wait for your question to come up. You can email your question to techtalk@layer7.com. So, Ronnie, how would you like to introduce WebSockets to us a little bit?
Sure. I think it's always a challenge. We keep getting new terminology that we have to learn in this industry. I think that's why it was important that we have this Tech Talk, right? To introduce what WebSockets are, so you know how to use them, if you need them. We'll talk a little bit about, I think, the security implications of this new type of technology. But at its base, a WebSocket is exactly what it sounds like. It's a socket connection that we can establish over web technologies. Right?
Okay.
There's obviously a little bit more to that, but hopefully over the next 40 minutes we'll dive into that detail and figure all this out together.
Okay. We've also got some exciting things happening in our own product with our mobile access gateway. I think the WebSockets in kind of an enterprise context, especially for mobile, is pretty exciting as well. So the talk isn't necessarily product focused, but if it comes around to how they are supported in our mobile access gateway, then that's interesting as well.
For sure.
Okay. So let's see if we can get our first question going here. So in general, what are some of the typical use cases for WebSockets?
Right. So I guess it helps to start out by talking a bit about what a WebSocket is.
Yeah.
I mentioned it's a socket over the web, but what does that mean? WebSocket allows a client to create a stateful connection to a server. So this means we have a way of communicating between the client and server in a bidirectional manner. And maybe it helps, if we dive into this use case, but to help understand what that means. A good example would be, let's say, a drawing program. So if you imagine an application deployed on your computer where you could draw a picture, that seems simple enough, right? Now if we say that as you draw, you want your drawing to be persisted somewhere else on a remote server. I could probably use HTTP for that, right? As I draw, the strokes get transmitted over the server and they get saved over there. But what happens if we want to create a collaborative drawing program? So one where I draw and then other artists, maybe you, Stephen, are also drawing, and we're looking at the same canvas. So how do we implement an application that can, both send brush strokes and receive brush strokes from you and then transmit them to me so we're seeing the same thing? That's where something like WebSockets becomes useful.
Okay.
Then beyond that, what if we scale it up? So instead we have 100 artists all working on the same canvas. It starts to become difficult to scale, so you need a low overhead way of sending data back and forth. That's a great use case for a WebSocket. I guess to put it into more of a business perspective, we can imagine things like trading applications where you need to see real-time data feeds, gaming applications. All of these are use cases for us to try out.
Okay. We do have a Twitter question from it looks like Boris, and I think you've been here before, so thanks for coming back. Appreciate that. WebSockets are awesome for browser-based apps, but I'm also considering using them for a mobile app. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So the history of WebSockets are that they enabled developers building browser-based applications to introduce socket-based protocols into the exchange, right? That's certainly the starting point. And the protocol itself defines a way of handshaking from an HTTP conversation into a WebSocket conversation. But there's nothing preventing you from using WebSockets outside of the browser. And I think if we look at what happened with HTTP, which started as a way of transmitting documents, and initially started as a browser-based mechanism for navigating the web, the protocol was useful, it became pervasive, and we started seeing a lot of non-browser-based usage. The same thing could equally happen with WebSockets, right? So I could have a mobile app, take advantage of existing WebSockets infrastructure when I want to make my massively multiplayer game. The other thing that's important to remember, mobile doesn't necessarily not browser-based. There's certainly a trend now to use things like HTML5, which has support for WebSockets, to build your apps. So if you're doing that and you're building on iOS, which has support for this protocol, then you'd certainly want to take advantage of that existing support. So short answer, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Good question, Boris. Thanks very much. So remind everybody too that's out there, don't forget to chat in your questions. Just click the red button, check in and chat. Twitter questions are great. Hashtag @Layer7Live. And we'll just keep going. So how are WebSockets different from Comet?
Right. So the history of this whole area, WebSockets wasn't the first way to get data quickly from a server. The problem existed for a while. If you look at the history of web applications, right, they started with this idea of a user clicks a button, a request is sent to a server, and the response is returned, and we provide the user with a display. The pattern of AJAX changed that. So now a client application could communicate with the server independent of the user input. And then the natural extension to that was this style called Comet, right? And the name is kind of funny, right? AJAX is a cleaning product, and Comet is another stuff. But Comet allows client applications to essentially do a long get or a long pull or whatever you want to call that, which means I make a request out to a server and I wait, and when the server has some interesting information, it sends it to me, and then I do something with it, and I immediately make another request to the server and wait. From a user perspective, whether you're using WebSockets or Comet, probably looking similar, right? But from an implementation perspective, there's a lot of important differences. One is Comet uses HTTP. So there's this overhead of having those headers going back and forth, which in a small scale, it's not a big deal. When you start scaling up to hundreds of users, thousands of users, that overhead starts to cost you, right? The other thing that Comet doesn't really give you is this concept of bidirectional communication. It's possible to do it, right? But it's just with a WebSocket, I can create a single stateful connection and then have data go back and forth, right? At the same time, I've got a socket where both the client and server can transmit data easily. So it's a natural fit. It's a better fit for many of these use cases. So if you think about that example I gave earlier, that Sketchpad program, you have to support many different kinds of connections. If I did that with Comet, if I do it with WebSockets, it's much easier to implement. And from the server side, it means we require less horsepower to support the use case.
Right, okay. And Boris has followed up from his earlier question. Let me just send that to you there. So Boris asks, WebSockets are awesome for, oh, sorry, that was the other question. WebSockets good for mobile apps. Thanks for answering the question. What about interoperability Microsoft implementation versus, say, Apple?
So I assume you're asking about, Windows Phone versus iOS, that kind of thing. To be honest, I haven't done a lot of mobile application development on Microsoft's platform. I do know for iOS there is support for WebSockets. I think on Android it's coming along with the home browser, and Android has that. But off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the Microsoft implementation versus Apple.
But if you wanted to email that question, or send me email us at techtalk at layer7.com, and I can find the answer out for you. We'll email you back. Looks like, let me just get back to Twitter. I think we might have another comment. Maybe somebody commenting on that. Just a comment from Francois through Twitter. Layer 7 WebSockets versus Comet, less overhead. Maybe just a comment on your last question about Comet.
Yeah, I think that sums it up for sure. If you use a WebSocket connection and you're transmitting data back and forth, you're not transmitting headers. You're transmitting the data once you've established the connection. If you're using Comet, it's a lot more as you have that conversation.
Pardon? Can a mobile application leverage WebSockets, or is it just for web applications? I think you sort of touched on that, but yeah, mobile versus web applications, is WebSockets appropriate?
Yeah, like I said earlier, I mean, it's an interesting question, because are we talking about browser-based applications versus native, or is it mobile versus web, right? And I think it's important to distinguish between those two things. So, as I said earlier, WebSockets have their roots in the idea of a socket connection being launched from a browser application. So let me elaborate on that a little bit with a clear example.
Sure.
Let's say I'm building a application that will let me make phone calls, right? Voice over IP. And for a second, let's imagine that there's not these hundreds of APIs on the web that will let me. We're starting from scratch. If I want to do that, little research, and I find out there's this protocol called SIP that will let me stream this data. Sounds useful, and I can establish that over a TCP/IP connection. So if I'm building a Windows application, a native Windows application, I'm going to use SIP directly, right? But what if I want to embed this phone application in the browser? How do I do that? This is where WebSockets becomes very handy, right? So now I could do SIP over WebSockets in the browser. And this is the real root of why we have this technology. It lets you build a TCP/IP-based protocol within frames, right? And use them within the browser. So that's the first part. So if we're talking about mobile or Windows or anywhere else, and we're building an application in the browser, we can use the socket. If we're building something native, we would probably go down to an actual protocol level. Right? Okay. But what happens as WebSockets starts to get widely adopted? Then suddenly we've got all this server infrastructure that supports WebSockets, right? And I think what's going to happen is it will start to make more and more sense to just leverage that, instead of trying to figure out, how do I connect to this type of server or that type of server. We'll have a single channel, and it's likely that it will be exposed over traditional web ports like 80 and 443. So, again, the short answer to that is, yeah, absolutely. You can use WebSockets within your mobile app, within your web-based apps. It really comes down to just choosing the appropriate technology for what you're building.
Okay, we have another question.
Yes, we do. Sorry, I just sort of lost my sound there for a second. I just want to make, I've got another question from Malik, it looks like. We'll get to you in 2 seconds. I just wanted to say there's a comment from Sanju Abraham. Says, can you please record and send the recording link? We'll post that link on our YouTube channel, we'll tweet it, and it'll be on our Facebook page after the show. If you want me to specifically send it to you, then just send us an email and I can send you the link through email. So again, the email is techtalk@layer7live.com. But like
techtalk@layer7.com.
Yeah, sorry, techtalk@layer7.com. I always get the hashtag confused. So anyway, Sanju, it'll be on YouTube, it'll be we'll tweet it, it'll be on Facebook, our LinkedIn corporate page, and it'll be on a Google+. So you can get it in any of those places. But if you really want a direct link, then just send us an email and I'll send you the link. Next question. Oh, that's what it is. Next question. Sorry, Ronnie, I've lost my internet connection. I'm on Wi-Fi, so
Okay.
I'll just have to read it out loud. He says 2 HTTP connection limit for browsers apply to Comet. Does that apply to WebSockets as well?
The only connection limit that I know of that applies to sockets would be the socket with the connection limit at the OS level. I'm not aware of a browser-based connection limit for WebSockets. There could be. If there is, I apologize for any misinformation. But you do highlight actual security challenge for WebSocket server implementation, which is how do you regulate the number of connections that are coming in, right? And this is called out in the spec as well, that you need safeguards, and this is why having a server that's secure enough to provide you with connection limits and rate limits is important, or having a gateway like ours.
We've got a question from Francois.
Yeah, Francois says, sorry again, I lost my Wi-Fi connection, so I'm sharing with Jose now.
Feel that I have a wired connection.
What about bridging between WebSocket traffic and HTTP traffic at perimeter?
Absolutely, that's a great use case. I'd say bridging with all kinds of traffic. So internally, you could have HTTP-based services, APIs. You might have a JMS-based messaging system, maybe something with MQ, right? And if you want to start exposing those transports via WebSockets, a gateway is a great solution for that. Certainly, I think where you see a lot of traction is in this idea of exposing enterprise messaging systems, right? Like those MQ-style messaging systems and JMS out to the wider world with a low-profile stateful connection like a WebSocket. It's a great use case.
Okay, we have another question for Ronnie.
Yeah. What kind of security risks do I need to worry about using a WebSocket?
There's quite a few. So, it seems like no matter what messaging protocol we talk about, we're dealing with a lot of the same thing, right? So you still need to worry about things like SQL injection, right? Cross-site scripting. All of our traditional security threats are still at play. On top of that, WebSockets are a great attack surface for denial of service attack, right? So the value of WebSockets is less overhead, so you can send lots of connections. But on the other hand, it means as a client, I can spin up a WebSocket connection and start hammering your server. What makes all of this more challenging is that unlike HTTP, where we have a defined request and a reply, with a WebSocket connection, once the client and server establish that socket, they're just going to start sharing data back and forth. So how does an intermediary inspect this data and figure out what to do, right? So what you really need is, in addition to your typical HTTP secure systems, you need something that can the frames of a WebSocket conversation. And you need to have security policies that will apply to those individual frames that are passing through the connection, right? And that's the big challenge. On top of that, there's a need for encryption of data, right? So data privacy, and WebSockets provides a protocol for that as well. So WSS is a TLS-based version of the WebSocket protocol. So from a mitigation perspective, if you employ something like a gateway, for example, our Layer 7 gateway, you can start to apply policies at a frame level, right? And start to inspect data for things like SQL injections.
Okay. Okay. You may have touched on this, but we'll just ask it again, just in case. Maybe you can clarify. Is HTTP a requirement for a WebSocket connection?
So this is an interesting question. We didn't really talk about how a WebSocket connection gets started. According to the specification, you start by sending an HTTP request with an upgrade that turns the conversation into a WebSocket conversation. I think early on, when the spec was getting defined, there was some consideration for this bootstrapping mechanism to be optional. But as far as I can tell now, my interpretation of the spec is that the WebSocket conversation is rooted in an HTTP conversation. So that initial HTTP message has to happen. But of course, that doesn't mean you have to be a browser-based application. You just need to be able to start the conversation in HTTP and then move it over to WebSocket. It does raise one other security concern. WebSockets uses an HTTP convention called upgrade. And recently, there was a lot of press about WebSockets not being secure because this upgrade command could poison caches in transparent proxies between the client and server. Because of that, WebSockets employs a data masking field. So data going from the client to the server must be masked. Masking is really just, you think of it as a primitive way of doing encryption, just hiding data so that those intermediate servers won't get impacted when you send that data. So to answer your question, as far as I can tell, yes, it does need to start with HTTP.
Okay. So you have got a next question?
I do. Does the WebSockets protocol specify a message format?
The only thing the WebSockets protocol specifies is a way to start the conversation, a data format for individual frames, or you can think of them as packets of data, and a way to end the conversation. Okay. It really is like having TCP/IP for the web. It's not TCP/IP, right? It's a layer above that, but it doesn't specify what those payloads look like, how they should be structured, or any of that detail. In fact, it defines the idea of sub-protocols. So if I want to do SOAP messaging, for example, there's a sub-protocol called SOAP over WebSockets that exists. And that way, I can have a sub-protocol that defines the message protocol that sits on top of the WebSockets protocol. If you actually look at the frame spec, it's just a few bytes at the beginning that indicate what the data will be, how long it is, and then insert your data here.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Which browsers support WebSockets?
So it's a constantly changing list of browsers. I would say that over the last year, I think support has gotten up to better. Google Chrome has great support on native systems. Firefox support is pretty good. I think Opera support is getting better. I think it's IE 10 is going to provide finally some good WebSocket support. There's actually a website you can go to easily determine browsers are supported right now. Let's see if I can just find the link here. You know what? Maybe we'll send it out or post it. Oh, I've got it. caniuse.com/WebSockets, which will give you that information right away. I think we link to it in our blog entries about WebSockets as well. So,
okay.
Go there and you'll see a nice picture of every browser, which versions, and whether they support WebSockets.
Right. Yeah, we've got two blog posts on WebSocket. So if you just go to layer7.com/blog, just sort of scroll through the categories, and there's a WebSocket category, or you can go right to Ronnie's posts, and Ronnie and our other API architect, principal API architect, Mike Amundsen, they did a part 1 and part 2 on WebSocket, so you can find those links there. Let me see, another question. Do I need a special WebSocket server for this?
Well, you certainly need a server, right? An HTTP server on its own will not extend the WebSocket conversation. You need something. In some cases, that can be an extension to the HTTP server. In other cases, it's a standalone server. You know, in our case, with the mobile access gateway, you've got that combined. So it has the ability to handle both, you know, traditional HTTP traffic as well as the WebSocket traffic. If you're running a different server, you know, there's tons of them on the internet. If you're using Apache or Jetty or any of those, you should be able to support both conversations. It's just a matter of configuration, I believe.
Okay. Does WebSockets have support for SSL?
It certainly does. It's part of the specification of WebSockets. You know, one of the nice things is that they've defined a URL. So the WebSocket protocol defined in the IETF specified WS as the non-secure WebSocket protocol, and WSS as the secure version of that protocol. And WSS does use TLS, so we get all of those benefits of encryption and protocol level authentication. You know, what we don't get that is things like support for OAuth or any of that. Still have to define that at the application level. So during that handshake, if I wanted to do OAuth-based authorization as I go into my WebSocket conversation, I need to include that in a header. And that means I need a server on the other end who's capable of using OAuth as an authorization scheme for a WebSocket conversation. And that's where you need specialized gateway servers. I
just wanted to mention quickly that my wireless connection is back, and I may have missed a question or two because they just sort of fall off the bottom of the feed. There is one here from Anthony Diaz, so sorry you had to wait. So Anthony asks, can WebSockets work well with load balancers? Does WebSockets create a sticky session with the server?
Yeah, this is an important question. You do need specialized load balancing if you're using WebSockets, only because we're talking about stateful connections again, right? Stickiness is a little bit different from the stickiness we would define for the web world, which was based on things like cookies, right? So that required an inspection of content to determine, you know, if this user has this cookie, where do we send the request? Which node behind the load balancer do we talk about? Here we're talking about a stateful TCP/IP session where the load balancer needs to be intelligent enough to know where to route messages as they come in on a single connection. I'm actually not an expert on that piece of infrastructure, but certainly these types of load balancers exist. And I think, Stephen, we can follow up if
sure.
he wants to find out more detail.
Yeah. So Anthony, if you need more detail for your question, we'll definitely reach back out. Just send us an email, techtalk@layer7.com. That way I'll have your email to reply, and we'll find the answer out for you. And just remind everybody to ask your last questions. I see there's quite a few people. Okay, Anthony's followed up. In the Microsoft stack, only Windows Server 2012 supports WebSockets. Can your gateway sit in front of a Windows 2008 server to enable WebSockets with a .NET application?
Absolutely, I believe so. I mean, we probably need more details before the guys in professional services tell me for saying, yeah, we can. But it certainly sounds like a use case that's a great fit for a gateway. So being an intermediary and enabling your existing service infrastructure to incorporate WebSockets, I mean, that's primarily what a gateway is for.
Okay, so the simple answer is yes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, any more questions out there? In the meantime, I'm just going to mention we've got an upcoming webinar. It's kind of an interesting topic. It's going to be October 4th at 9 a.m., 12 Eastern. Title of which is Open APIs plus Software Competitions Equal Innovative and Creative Solutions, featuring Challenge Post. So basically the idea is using software competitions to promote your API. So it's going to be really interesting, a little bit different than hackathons, but also a great way to promote your API. So if you go to our website, the webinar is going to be October 4th. Just find our events link and click webinars, and you can register there. And then we'll also be back with another Tech Talk. I believe it's October 16th. Maybe it's mid-October, and stay tuned. We'll make sure to tweet, and we'll have that on our Facebook page for sure, the website as well, Google+, all our social networks. So I just want to double check that we don't have any more questions that we missed. We often get some towards right at the end through Twitter or through the Facebook stream. Ronnie, do you have any kind of final thoughts?
Yeah, one thing I certainly want to address, and I'd be remiss if I didn't, because I care a lot about APIs, particular HTTP API. And I think early on, as WebSockets started to emerge as a possibility for client-server communication over the internet, there's some question of whether this would become the new technology that replaces all of the HTTP-style APIs that we had built so far. Right. And I think this is wrong. I believe these are complementary technologies. They solve particular problems, right? And we would really be making a mistake if we just disregarded the beauty of using HTTP for communication, right? A loosely coupled, very scalable messaging protocol with things like content types and a lot of work and definition to make it possible for us to build things like browsers and clients of APIs that work well. I see the value here is in bringing these things together, right? There's going to be specific use cases that are difficult to employ with a request-reply mechanism. So there's no reason we can't publish an API that primarily supports HTTP, but is capable of transmitting a link to a WebSocket conversation, so a client can use that as well, right? So I think as an API community, I want us to be smart about using this technology. I think this is something that we at Layer7 talk about a lot in terms of use appropriate technologies here, right? And if you're only going to take one thing away from this, it's that. WebSockets, what they're good for, and then apply them appropriately.
Okay, great. I just wanted to mention to Anthony as well, if you're still in the stream, Francois, he's our chief architect, and it looks like he's reached out and said he'd love to follow up with you about your Microsoft Stack question, the Windows Server support. and he's got his email up there, so it's flaskelis@layer7.com. So if you could email him directly, he could follow up and talk about the specifics of your stack. Other than that, thanks everybody, and we've got people all over North America checking in. Thanks for your questions. Ronnie, thank you.
Thank you.
And again, just one final, if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, or you think of things in the next few minutes, don't hesitate to tweet them, hashtag Layer7Live. You can always send an email question to techtalk@layer7.com, and we'll be happy to answer them. So thanks very much, and join us in that October 4th webinar, competitions to promote your APIs. It's going to be good. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time.